History painted Jane Seymour as Henry VIII's obedient, quiet wife, but there was a hidden side to this angelic queen, and her story is filled with both triumph and tragedy. She is often remembered as Henry's most beloved queen, but what he said while she was giving birth was absolutely heartless. Jane started out as a lady-in-waiting to Henry's first queen, Catherine of Aragon, when she was still in her late teens or early 20s. By this time, Henry's relationship with Catherine was in shambles, mainly due to her inability to produce a male heir. It would be romantic to say that King Henry fell in love with Jane at first sight, but that's not what happened at all. During her first years of service, Henry was actually madly in love with Anne Boleyn. Jane patiently waited as Henry divorced Catherine and married Boleyn in 1533. Anne was Queen of England, but not for long. Anne Boleyn had a bewitching magic about her, but Jane Seymour was no slouch in the beauty department either. As for Jane's personality, where Anne was dark and mysterious, Jane was considered calm and sweet. One courtier called her the gentlest woman I ever knew, and she earned the nickname Pacific for her apparently serene calm at court. But don't judge a queen by her nickname. Jane knew how to survive in Henry's vicious court. She shifted seamlessly into a position as Anne Boleyn's lady-in-waiting once Catherine was gone. Henry was initially smitten with Anne, but the good times didn't last long. Just like Catherine before her, Anne didn't give him the male heir he so craved, and soon enough the king's eye was wandering right over to Jane Seymour. He obviously liked what he saw, and by 1536, everyone in court knew he was pursuing her. Things were about to get very messy. Henry showered Jane with expensive gifts and baubles, all behind Anne Boleyn's back. He even gave Jane a beautifully crafted locket necklace with his own portrait inside. Subtle. Jane might have looked sweet on the outside, but she knew exactly how to hit where it hurt. One day, she started casually snapping open and shut her locket right in front of Anne, letting the queen see glimpses of Henry's face around her throat. Anne's response was far from serene. She ripped the locket right off of Jane's neck, snapping the chain with such force that her fingers actually bled from the effort. Apparently, Henry was rather unoriginal when it came to giving gifts. While they were courting, he had gifted Anne Boleyn a bracelet with, you guessed it, his portrait inside. Knowing that, it's no wonder Anne lost it at the sight of the locket. In 1536, Queen Anne Boleyn was pregnant. If it was a boy, and if she carried him to term, then all bets were off for Jane. If Anne didn't, well, that was another story entirely. But few people knew that Jane played a very active role in Anne's downfall. According to one story, Anne walked into a room one afternoon and witnessed a scandalous sight. Sweet little Jane was casually lounging on her husband's lap. Anne flew into a rage, and the consequences were devastating. According to one source, it was Anne's violent reaction that caused her to miscarry her precious baby less than 4 months into the pregnancy. Even worse, it was in fact a boy. Everyone, Jane included, knew that this was the beginning of the end for Anne Boleyn. Again and again throughout Tudor history, we hear about how innocent Jane was, but of course the truth is much more complicated than that. While Anne recovered from the physical and mental trauma of her miscarriage, Jane moved herself and her family into royal quarters. Now she was 1 inch closer to the throne. With Jane conveniently posted next to his bedroom, Henry officially declared that Boleyn had bewitched him and charged her with a variety of lewd and trumped-up charges, including treason. Then, on May 19, 1536, Jane received the news she had been waiting for. Queen Anne had gone to the executioner's block. King Henry and Jane Seymour didn't even wait until Anne's body was cold to declare their love. The new royal power couple got betrothed on May 20th, 1536. That's right, one day after Anne Boleyn's execution. 10 days later, King Henry and Jane made it official in a relatively private wedding ceremony at Whitehall Palace. Henry announced his new wife to the public, and Queen Jane Seymour could bask in her royal glory at last. Jane was incredibly popular with the commoners. The people saw in Jane a return to the wholesomeness that Henry's first wife had represented, and she was worlds away from the scandalous and widely hated Anne Boleyn. Jane was certainly attractive enough to Henry, but he may have married her for a completely different reason. She came from a large family of 9 children. Naturally, King Henry and his advisors hoped Jane would prove half as fertile as her mother. Aw, how romantic. In many ways, Jane was very different from Henry's other wives. Although she was from a noble family, she was lower in rank than both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, and her education wasn't exactly progressive. Instead of knowing languages and literature, she could barely read and write. Queen Jane decreed that her ladies-in-waiting had to adhere to a code of conduct, one where they had to be chaste and think only about how they could serve God and be virtuous. Now, remember, Jane started out as a lady-in-waiting before becoming Henry's mistress, so this was a very smart move on her part. There were some perks to marrying King Henry VIII. After the wedding, Henry granted her no fewer than 104 manors across 4 counties and threw in a bunch of literal forests to sweeten the deal. Much better than a toaster or some fancy china. She knew her duty as queen was to satisfy King Henry in the bedroom and then the maternity ward, and half a year after her royal wedding, she was pregnant with Henry's child. It was Jane Seymour's turn to prove to Henry that she wasn't like the other girls. Sadly, she ended up miscarrying, yet Jane had a stubborn and iron will, and she wasted no time getting back into bed with Henry. Less than a month later, she was pregnant again, and this one would change history. Being Henry VIII's wife was a very dangerous job, and Jane worked hard to keep that job. One day, Henry put her in her place with a brutal remark. She had gently begged the king to grant a pardon, and Henry became incensed at her presumption. Chillingly, he reminded her what happened when Anne Boleyn tried to meddle in his affairs. Henry was absolutely determined not to have another miscarriage, and he retired Jane from all public duties by the summer of 1537, forcing her into a devastatingly lonely life. By September, she was in complete confinement and awaiting the birth of her child. One of Jane's distinguishing qualities was her ghostly pale skin, considered the height of beauty in Tudor times, but this feature may have had a dangerous side. Historians suggest that Jane suffered from anemia, a lack of iron in the blood. She was likely in no state to go into childbirth, but there was no stopping it now. Jane went into labor in early October of 1537, but nothing happened the way she expected it. Historians now believe her baby was in an awkward position, and the childbirth was a terrifying and tormented affair, with Jane pushing for a grueling 2 days and 3 nights, all the while knowing she might be drawing her last breath. During Jane's difficult labor, the doctors worried it would come down to a choice between saving the baby and saving the mother. According to one report, when attendants asked the king what he wanted to do, his reply was utterly heartless. "If you cannot save both, at least let the child live," he said. He then added, "For wives are easily found." At 2 in the morning, on October 12, 1537, Jane Seymour finally had her child. To Henry's absolute delight, it was a healthy, living boy. Jane and the king named the child Edward VI, and at first, it seemed like she was going to get everything she wanted and more. In the immediate moments after Edward's birth, nothing at all seemed to be the matter with the baby or with the queen. Jane was signing letters the evening after the birth, and on October 15th, She even received guests and was sitting up in bed, but soon it would all take a turn for the worse. On the 16th, just a few days after giving birth, accounts describe Jane experiencing a lax, which might have been postpartum bleeding or loose bowels. 16th century medicine had a long way to go, so it's difficult to assess what exactly went wrong after Jane Seymour's lengthy labor. A scandalous whisper emerged in court. Many people claimed that, desperate to get his son from Jane's ravaged body, Henry had ordered a cesarean section for his queen, a procedure that was a certain death sentence at the time. Friday, October 19th, Jane was incredibly unwell, and her health only plummeted over the weekend. By that Monday, the attendants knew she was in great danger, so much so that King Henry rushed to her bedside the next night. It ended up being their last goodbye. Even at the time, many theories tried to explain what Jane was suffering from post-childbirth. The most compelling evidence comes from a report from her own time. The document states that she had a cold and couldn't eat proper food. This account actually contains vital evidence. According to Tudor expert Alison Weir, this document indicates that Jane's sickness might have started out innocently enough as food poisoning. After all, this would explain the attention to the kinds of food Seymour was eating at the time. When it comes to the Great Cold, Weir suggests a much more complicated explanation. Jane's cold may have actually been signs of an embolism that flowed from her heart, particularly if the already weak Jane was rushing to the bathroom to vomit from her food poisoning. Whatever the cause, the end was drawing near. On October 24, 1537, Jane Seymour passed in her bed at 2 a.m, almost the exact same time that she had given birth to her longed-for son Edward just days prior. The 29-year-old Jane was Queen of England for fewer than 2 years. On November 12, 1537, the king held Jane Seymour's funeral at Windsor Castle. During the service, her beloved stepdaughter Mary acted as chief mourner, and Henry put out all the stops to commemorate the wife who had given him a son at last. 29 mourners followed her procession, one for each brief year of her life. Henry was never the same after her death, either mentally or physically. After Jane's passing, the depressed Henry put on weight, developed diabetes and gout, and became the corpulent, volatile monarch we know him as today. Henry was so bereft at Jane's passing that he could barely cope. In fact, for the first time in his life, he actively mourned a wife. Well, as best he could anyway. Henry wore black for 3 whole months, which must have been a record for him. He even held off on marrying for 2 years after Jane's passing. But it would take a decade for his most heartbreaking tribute. Jane had to sacrifice a lot to get King Henry VIII, but she was at least luckier than his later wives. Jane had Henry in his best years, when the king was famous for his auburn hair, athletic good looks, and hadn't, executed 1/3 of his wives. Many historians speculate that of all of King Henry VIII's many, many wives, Jane Seymour was always his absolute favorite. But why? It probably wasn't because of her charming personality. Likely it was because she gave him a male heir. Jane chose a phoenix rising from a fort, with red and white painted Tudor roses as her emblem. The phoenix is a symbol of rebirth, and historians speculate that Jane chose this figure to represent a rebirth from Henry's time with Anne Boleyn. Not that it mattered. In the end, just like her rival, Queen Jane Seymour met her own tragic end. When Henry passed in 1547, almost exactly 10 years after Jane's own passing, his last wish was for his attendants to bury him beside her. To Henry, Jane always remained his true queen. Jane's epitaph gives further confirmation of Henry's devotion to her. The touching inscription reads as follows: "Here lies Jane, a phoenix, who died in giving another phoenix birth. Let her be mourned, for birds like these are rare indeed." Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe for more fascinating content.